Now, there's no doubt that violent crime is on the rise in the country, but how are our law enforcement authorities dealing with the issue? In GBV cases in particular, there is a massive backlog in DNA testing, just speaking about it there in the piece we just heard, and it's having a serious impact on rape victims and successful convictions of perpetrators. For more on this now, let's speak to Ian Cameron, who is with Action Society. He's their spokesperson and their Director of Community Safety, and he joins us from Cape Town. Ian, thanks so much for joining us. We just heard there in a story from a soundbite from Vanessa Lynch speaking about a further DNA backlog being expected once the criminal law or forensic procedures bill is adopted, as you've said. Can you just bring us up to speed with where we are in the adoption of that bill and how quickly we'll see an impact of that?
Yes, so it has been approved by the Portfolio Committee on Police in the last week, and now it has to go to Parliament for further approval. I think it's more or less done. I think the more worrisome part is now the actual implementation of it on ground level.
Before we speak about that impact and the implementation of it, I mean, it did take quite some time for us to get to this point where we are hopefully on the brink of it being adopted. Your organization has pointed out that while government was dragging their feet to get this crucial legislation approved, almost 100,000 violent criminals had been released since 2016 without submitting a DNA sample. Now, we'll probably never be able to put a figure or the stories to what kind of impact that dragging of feet from government has had.
Yeah, I think it's infuriating, to be honest. I think it just goes to show that there's absolutely no political will to solve these kinds of issues. The South African Police Service and even the National Prosecuting Authority is riddled with incompetence and corruption. And I'm saying it very bluntly, but prove otherwise. You know, almost 100,000 murderers and rapists were set free without any form of DNA sampling having been done. And there was no reason for the delay. It was just purely a case of not being a priority to government. And one must ask, as you correctly said, how many other victims might there have been because of these perpetrators? You know, the sampling of DNA from Schedule 8 offenders, rapists, murderers, etc., would make it so much easier to not only populate the National Forensics Database, but it would also have a massive impact on being able to link them to future crimes. So it could be a deterrent to violent crime. The fact of the matter is, one of the almost 150 rapes per day in South Africa, or the almost 60 murders per day, could actually have been prevented had this been done in time.
What does your research tell you about perpetrators of gender-based violence in particular? Is there any research to show that a certain number of these perpetrators are indeed repeat offenders?
Well, from what we know, they are very often repeat offenders. Unfortunately, also, the majority of them are known to the victims themselves. I think to take it a little bit further to show how bad the actual conviction rate on these cases is, only 1 in 12 cases that are concluded actually end with a guilty conviction. And remember, those are only the ones that actually make it to court, where the prosecution process is actually able to take its course. Further information from the Medical Research Council's latest report from 2021 shows us that actually almost 9% of cases were finalized with a guilty verdict for sexual offenses. And so the list goes on, and I can paint a very gloomy picture. I think the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, very often they're known to the perpetrator. Yes, they're very often repeat offenders. And I always refer to the case of Sipukazi Boy, 2021, Mbekweni in the Western Cape. Her partner is out on bail after having beaten her into a hospital to the point where she's unrecognizable. And he gets bail, first of all. So that's the first issue that I have. The second point is, she is then released from hospital and he ends up murdering, dismembering her, and then setting her on fire. And so there's a whole list of these kinds of examples, Chantal Makwena, and so the list continues. The point is that this is the actual pandemic in South Africa, and the political will is just not there to solve it.
Let's talk now about implementation, as you mentioned earlier, about when this Criminal Law Forensic Procedures Amendment Bill is indeed passed. What are you expecting from implementation on the ground? Because we do understand, just like the rest of law enforcement, that the men and women who work in forensics are highly under-resourced as well. What are you expecting from the rollout of the implementation of that bill?
Well, just in terms of the DNA backlog, there's still many questions about that. The information that we have from the beginning of May 2022 showed us that there are about 56,000 cases still part of the backlog. But remember, those are cases that were ring-fenced from the original 300,000 cases. So it would actually be far more had they counted the cases that were constantly coming in. What do we expect on ground level? Well, we expect a further bottleneck to happen because not only are they ill-resourced, but training on ground level isn't happening. The cops that I have a lot of contact with on ground level, ones that really do everything they can with very limited resources and terrible leadership, just tell us that there is no training. When there is training, it's not of a high standard. They haven't even been spoken to about this. So we're close to implementation, but you've got 145,000 operational members in uniform that need to understand this process. I know every single one of them won't necessarily be in direct contact, but this is something that needs to be implemented in the South African Police Service as a whole. It can't be done half-heartedly because then it's not going to have an impact.
And speaking of impact, the repercussions of that rollout or that implementation at grassroots level, if it's not done in the right way, if it's not done in a respectful way, the impact then also then just continues this vicious cycle where already we know rape and gender-based violence is underreported in South Africa, and the rollout or the implementation of this new bill will probably then just lead to more women and children feeling that they're not being backed up, they're not being supported. And what is the point in any case of reporting this violence if the system is not going to support them, whether it is at police station level, at court level, or indeed at forensics level?
So I want to confirm that and emphasize what you said. There are about 4 or 5 points that I want to share very briefly. I think the first one is that at the current moment, in terms of sexual offences, less than 1 in 5 cases actually make it to trial. So that's very, very low. The data from the Medical Research Council shows us that prosecutors withdraw almost half, it's about 46%, of cases they had enrolled before trial had even started. So that shows you that evidence and investigation is lacking. And very often we see cases scrapped from the roll because the DNA report wasn't available. Now, I know the Convicted Offender Bill and the DNA backlog are 2 separate matters, but they link with each other. And it's very important to consider the role that both of them play in ensuring that DNA is used as a key tool, a very important tool to confirm or ensure successful conviction. And the last point I want to make is that this study also showed us that only about 18% of cases actually make it to trial. So, yes, I think we're in for a very, very serious challenge. Remember, in South Africa, only 1 in 9 rapes are actually reported. So we have this number of between 120 and 150 rapes per day, but only 1 in 9 are actually reported. So the number is actually far bigger. And if you spend time, I was in the Cape Flats last week, and one of the specific stations I visited have an average of about 20 domestic violence cases reported per weekend. So it's far higher than we actually realize.
Okay, Ian, thank you so much for that. 1 in 9 rapes is actually reported in South Africa. That tells you almost everything you need to know about the massive battle we have ahead of us here in South Africa. That's Ian Cameron, the Director of Community Safety at Action Society, is also their spokesperson, joining us there from Cape Town. We thank him for his time.